A number of people have been inquiring my thoughts, my perspective on some pretty heavyweight topics. Things like tariffs, economic outlook. And one that I'm not getting so much but is a major concern for me is the fact the disparity, the inequality, especially how God's people, that economic models have not been truly benefiting them. And how do they break that paradigm? How do they change their position? How do they literally rise to the top? And I think the most important thing for us is to start from a perspective of what God is doing in this hour. And part of that is, and I have mentioned this a number of times in the prior months, is the recognition that old paradigms are fading away. Now, it's easy to kind of just take that as a nice thought and not know how to respond to it. And what we see is so many clinging to the old models. But even just this past week, at the time of the recording, the CEO of Blackstone, one of the largest investment managers in the world, acknowledged that old retirement strategies that worked for decades will not be effective going forward. Now, he offered some suggestions that he thought might be better, but it first off does two things. Number one, it reinforces that understanding, the recognition that if we're forward looking, we understand that those old paradigms will no longer be effective. But don't let that disturb you. Don't let that rob you of your peace. But it also reminds us that there will be many increasingly who will come across as the experts who are going to tell you they have the strategy, the secret, so on, to succeed in any environment. And as I always tell you, you don't want a strategy. You want to know how to think. You want to know how to recognize it, because what God does in each person is absolutely individual. Those blanket strategies are gimmicks, and your success will come from the leading of the Holy Spirit, as we will see in just a moment. But a better way to look at this is a shifting landscape. Think of tectonic plates below the surface grinding against each other. When that is done, the landscape above is radically different. And the reality is, you and I cannot envision truly what that landscape will look like down the road. However, we are in a relationship with the one who knows exactly what it will look like and the one who knows exactly how to position us. And so what I would share would be, first off, is the recognition that it is changing, that old paradigms are fading away. But again, not responding out of fear, but out of a confidence that this is an opportunity for God to transform, for Him to break your personal paradigms, for Him to position you for a degree of success, prosperity, blessing, influence you never expected. In fact, hold that thought about unexpected influence. But how do we do that? How do we view it? How do we think about it so that we can recognize it? And I reflect upon when the Israelites went into the promised land. And Joshua said something very profound to them. He said, follow closely behind the Ark of the Covenant, that representation of God's presence, because you've never been this way before. That, in other words, don't stay close to God. Let Him guide us through this journey. And while there were challenges, there were better blessings awaiting them than they even imagined. And that is my view, my perspective for God's people. That God is increasingly, I've talked about this a number of times over the prior months also, God is increasingly making a distinction. And not just a distinction between His people and the rest of the world, but even among God's people, we're seeing an increasing distinction between those who are led by, or should I say, desire to be led by the Holy Spirit, and those that are clinging to their comfort. They're clinging to old models, old paradigms, unwilling to break those molds, unwilling to be uncomfortable. That it is an era, a season, where God is calling on His people to be led by the Lord, and see their situation transformed. But so many people say to me so often, we love that idea, that sounds great, but we don't necessarily have this great confidence in hearing the Holy Spirit. Maybe they've had some glimmers, some glimpses, they have moments, but they don't have that confidence in the consistency of hearing from the Holy Spirit. And if you haven't caught it, get our episode we did recently called Process in Not Perfection. It's 7-8 minutes. Invest the time in it about understanding how we can approach the Holy Spirit, not out of perfection of hearing perfectly, but understanding the process so that we grow in that confidence. But regardless, it's time to have that profound faith expectation. Go to God, ask Him to show you, and regardless of circumstances, have that profound faith expectation that God will show you how to be positioned, how to basically navigate things, even when you don't understand, but having that faith expectation that God will position you for breakthrough, greater blessings, and it will mean breaking some old paradigms in the process. Number 2, and this one always ruffles the little feathers, don't rely on artificial security. Now, artificial security is anything we're looking to besides God to give us that stability, give us that comfort, make it work, make it okay. So whether that's right now you're hearing lots of talk about cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, whether it's precious metals, whether it's specific strategies, anything that we're relying on other than God to give us that victory is artificial security. Now, in leaning on God, He may say individually to you to use a strategy or a tool or a technique. But again, that's being led by the Spirit, not relying on that, but relying on the Spirit. And expect that profound blessing, that profound paradigm shift, because God desires that you would have an abundance for every good work, that you would literally be the head and not the tail, and so on. But I also talked about expecting unexpected influence. In Exodus, when God was shifting His people out of their past, out of their bondage, out of their hard labor, into the better blessings He had waiting in the land of promise, He did through miracles, through displays of power, through shaking. And increasingly, though, what we saw is even those who weren't among God's people began to take notice. They began to reflect. And specifically, when Moses announced the hail coming, what you saw is among the Egyptians, those who took notice and took action. They brought their animals, their workers, they brought everybody under shelter as they saw God's people do, because they were increasingly recognizing the reality of God at work. In fact, as a consequence, eventually, when God's people left Egypt with great blessing on their journey to the land of promise, there were a number of non-Israelites, Egyptians and so on, who wanted to go with them. They chose to go with God's people. They recognized the reality of God through that shaking, through those displays of power and God's work in His people. So as a consequence, focusing and leaning into being led by the Spirit through this season, expecting God to position you for breakthrough, for victory, for old paradigms to be shattered, for you to rise, expect there to be influence and impact on those around you that you least expect. This is a season to embrace that distinction. And the way to do that is leaning on the Holy Spirit, being willing to let go of how we perceive things should work, how they've worked for so long, recognizing God is shifting those, but God can also lead us into a new approach, a new positioning for that greater victory.